In Russia, they have revealed the real objectives of the special military operation. They want to occupy several more new regions and, in fact, never plan to meet with Zelensky. Trump has already responded and is preparing an emergency statement at the White House for this evening. Meanwhile, the CIA has exposed its agents in Moscow and Fico is suddenly heading to Kyiv. The occupiers are planning to strike at the energy sector. Drone reconnaissance is already underway. The Ukrainian armed forces destroyed an enemy, Solntsepyok, and liberated a village in the Donetsk region. But the Kremlin has dragged Yanukovych out of oblivion. The statement from the Botoxed fugitive grandpa made Ukrainians laugh. I'll tell you all the details later in this episode. My name is Katerina Kolhen. Let's start this informational Tuesday together. Now they're not even hiding their true intentions. Behind the Russian chief of the general staff, Gerasimov, a map of Ukraine with redrawn borders was spotted. On it, even the Odesa and Mykolaiv regions are marked as part of Russia, as well as parts of Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea. So it's not just the regions that Russian troops partially control, but even Odesa and Mykolaiv, where not a single Russian soldier has set foot. They've also attached those to the occupied territories. According to Russian journalist Yaroslav Trofimov, who works as a correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, this map likely reflects Russia's military objectives in Ukraine. To me, this map looks like a provocation and propaganda. By the way, Gerasimov's briefing was dedicated to successes in the war, but now everyone's attention is focused on the map with an alternative reality, which supposedly ended up in the frame either by accident or not. And to add fuel to the fire, Viktor Sobolev, a member of the Russian State Duma's Defense Committee, also weighed in. In an interview with Russian media, he stated that the Sumy, Kharkiv, Dnipropetrovsk, Mykolaiv, and Odessa regions are territories that correspond to the goals of their special military operation. These goals must be achieved, he said. Medvedev has already had similar marginal fantasies, publicly declaring a year ago that Odessa, Dnipro, Kharkiv, Mykolaiv, and Kyiv are Russian cities temporarily occupied. And back in 2022, Dugin, the very same philosopher of the Putin regime, was already sharing futuristic maps where Odessa was part of the Russian Federation. And while some Russian generals dream of capturing more of Ukraine, Putin's aide Yuri Ushakov decided to announce that during his Tsar's meeting with Trump in Alaska, no trilateral talks with Zelensky were planned.
Voiceover translated from Russian into Ukrainian.
Meanwhile, in Washington, there were renewed threats of sanctions. However, it wasn't Trump who said this, but rather the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, Scott Bessent. He says all sanction options are on the table and Trump will carefully consider them.
After the call, when European leaders and Zelensky were at the White House, he did the exact opposite of what he had promised. In fact, he outrageously intensified the bombing. So with Trump, all options are on the table and we will carefully consider them this week.
Meanwhile, the U.S. is pressuring Europe to completely stop buying Russian oil and gas. This is reported by Axios. The article states that the Trump administration is losing patience with European leaders who are allegedly prolonging the war in Ukraine with unrealistic demands. Washington is urging the EU to impose secondary tariffs on India and China as strict as the American 50% tariffs because Delhi and Beijing are actively buying up Russian oil, indirectly financing Moscow's aggression. In India, everything has already become more expensive. Textiles, jewelry, pharmaceuticals. Exports have dropped by 40 to 50%. The EU is India's second largest trading partner, with trade amounting to $140 billion. China is being spared for now due to more complicated relations. As for Trump himself, who hasn't appeared in public for a week now, this has sparked an active discussion about the reasons for his absence on social media, with some people even declaring him dead. And now the White House has published the schedule of the American president. Today at 21 Kyiv time, Donald Trump will make an important statement. They did not specify what the topic of the statement would be. Yesterday marked the end of another 2-week deadline set by Trump for Putin regarding steps toward peace in Ukraine. At the same time, journalists probably know where he disappears for weeks at a time. They calculated that Donald Trump has spent 30% of his time as president playing golf. Out of 225 days in office, he spent 65 days playing golf. Meanwhile, Trump's inner circle is increasingly finding itself embroiled in scandals. For example, the U.S. Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, revealed the name of a top-secret CIA agent who was working undercover in Russia. Why did she do that? Watch further for the details of the scandal.
American intelligence has found itself at the center of a major scandal. The blow to the system was dealt by its own head, Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard. She not only revoked the security clearance of dozens of former and current intelligence officers, but also publicly revealed the name of a CIA agent who had worked undercover in Russia for many years.
Access to information constituting a state secret is a privilege, not a right. Those members of the intelligence community who betray their oath to uphold the Constitution and place their own interests above those of the American people violate the sacred trust they have sworn to protect. Such actions undermine our national security, the safety of U.S. citizens, and the fundamental principles of a democratic republic.
On August 19th, Gabbard published on the social network X a list of 37 officials who had been stripped of access to classified information. Most of them were involved in analyzing data on Russia's interference in the 2016 presidential election. Some of them signed a letter in 2019 calling for the impeachment of Donald Trump.
This is why US President Donald Trump and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence decided to revoke security clearances for 37 current and former intelligence officers. This also concerns those who abuse public trust by politicizing and manipulating intelligence, making unauthorized leaks of classified information and/or knowingly committing serious violations of professional standards.
But at the same time, the list also included people on whom the work of American intelligence against the Kremlin directly depended. Among them is a CIA officer who worked undercover in Russia for decades. According to the Wall Street Journal, even the Office of the Director of National Intelligence was unaware that his name was classified.
The unmasking of the officer's identity could jeopardize the agency's cover system and also harm relations with foreign governments.
A leading CIA expert on Russia was also put at risk. She worked at the agency for nearly 30 years and participated in preparing the August meeting between the US and Russian presidents in Alaska. Now, her career is effectively over.
In the digital age, you can encounter a huge amount of information that one way or another ends up on the internet. Unfortunately, the level of competence among those in power is getting worse, and leaks of various kinds of information will happen more and more often. Will this damage the reputation of the United States of America? Of course it will. How critical will it be? I don't think it will be critical for the US, like, that's it, we won't work with them anymore. It's not so significant right now that some information was unfortunately leaked, because regrettably, the prevailing policies of the United States, the European Union, and indeed many other countries around the globe are progressively becoming very, very deeply polarized. They are increasingly becoming vulnerable from both opposing sides. We can clearly observe and understand how remarkably different US policy was under the administration of President Biden compared to its direction under the administration of President Trump, illustrating a profound shift in approach and priorities. That's why the leaking of information doesn't really affect. It will have an impact on processes, but not to the extent that it would fundamentally change the world picture.
Tulsi Gabbard's own career is also full of contradictions. A veteran of the Iraq War from 2013 to 2021, she served as a congresswoman from the Democratic Party, and in 2019 she attempted to run for president but later endorsed Joe Biden. In 2022, she left the Democratic Party, calling it an elitist cabal of warmongers. Even earlier, in 2017, Gabbard met with Bashar al-Assad in Damascus, sharply criticized American operations in Syria, and opposed aid to Ukraine. On the day of the Russian invasion, she wrote that this war could have been prevented if the US and NATO had recognized Russia's legitimate concerns about Ukraine joining the alliance. A month later, she shared a video claiming that there were allegedly American-funded biolabs operating in Ukraine. At that time, Republican Senator Mitt Romney accused her of repeating false Russian propaganda. That is why her current actions raise the question, is this a decisive blow against the intelligence community's bureaucracy, or a move that weakens the US position in its confrontation with Russia?
Russian propagandists published a video featuring Viktor Yanukovych. In it, the former president of Ukraine claims that he deliberately worked towards bringing Ukraine closer to the EU, but that the Europeans behaved inappropriately. Yanukovych also stated that he had always been a categorical and staunch opponent of Ukraine joining NATO.
Yes, Vladimir Vladimirovich is absolutely right. Indeed, I deliberately worked on bringing Ukraine closer to the European Union and ultimately set the goal of Ukraine joining the European Union. However, the EU partners sometimes behaved, to put it mildly, inappropriately during the negotiations. They did not show an understanding of the complexity of the economic situation in Ukraine. Frankly speaking, they displayed arrogance. But I was the one controlling and pushing forward the process of Ukraine's accession to the EU.
When and where this video was recorded is not specified, assuming, of course, that it is genuine. But these shots really amused Ukrainians. There are tons of memes online. Most of all, people are discussing Yanukovych's appearance, especially his new teeth. Some suggest that in his quest for self-improvement, he might reach the level of the legendary queen of the DPR and even vie for Pushilin's position. Meanwhile, the Institute for the Study of War explained why Yanukovych has reappeared on TV screens. Analysts believe that it is quite likely the Kremlin timed the fugitive ex-president's address to precede the speech of the Russian dictator Putin at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. In this way, the Russians want to lend legitimacy to Putin's demand for regime change in Ukraine. Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico is preparing for a meeting with Zelensky. The Slovak Prime Minister announced this in an address to citizens on the occasion of the country's Constitution Day. This is the first contact between the leaders of Ukraine and Slovakia since Fico returned to office in 2023. But first, he is flying to China for talks with Putin and Xi Jinping, The Guardian reports. The details of the meeting with Zelensky are still being kept secret. However, it is known that it is scheduled for September 5th. So we are waiting for updates.
Therefore, I would like to confirm that during my visit to Beijing, I will hold bilateral meetings with Chinese President Xi Jinping, Russian President Vladimir Putin, and other attending state leaders. After returning from Beijing on Thursday evening, I will head to eastern Slovakia to hold a bilateral meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on Friday.
Orban has finally exasperated the EU as well. 10 EU countries have proposed changing the procedure for making foreign policy decisions, moving from the principle of unanimity to approval by a qualified majority, Bloomberg reports, citing a document. The authors believe that such a step would allow for faster action and prevent individual countries from blocking measures supported by almost all members of the Union. The reason for this was Hungary's stance, as it consistently opposes initiatives regarding Ukraine, blocks the allocation of funds to it, and hinders its accession to the EU.
The European Union has begun considering abandoning unanimous decision-making due to Hungary's constant vetoes. We have 6 and 6 billion euros blocked, and we have offered our Hungarian colleagues various options, for example, to abstain as was done in NATO and other possibilities. But there was no effect. And today, all the countries raise this issue of unblocking. You don't have to be part of it, but let others do it.
Against the backdrop of escalating security risks for Europe, the issue of consensus in decision-making, let's put it this way, decisions requiring 100% of the votes from European Union countries will now be reconsidered. How much time this will take and exactly how these decisions will be reviewed, what kind of process or algorithm will be proposed, it's hard to say at this point.
In recent months, Hungary has been turning increasingly toward Russia in exchange for cheap Russian gas and oil.
We're talking now as if this military situation is open-ended, but that's not the case. Ukraine has lost the war. Russia has won this war. The only question is when and under what circumstances the Western countries backing Ukraine will acknowledge that this has happened and what the consequences will be.
Hungary is not some kind of structural pillar for the European Union. It is not a particularly important economy for the EU, and essentially it's only Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, who constantly exploits the blocking of European issues.
The Hungarian Minister of Foreign Affairs is threatening Ukraine with a power cutoff over strikes on Russian oil facilities.
A very overt anti-Hungarian policy is being pursued in Ukraine, and Ukrainians expect that Brussels and their Hungarian proxies are putting enough pressure on Hungary for it to take a position that aligns with Ukraine's interests. Hungary supplies 30 to 40% of Ukraine's electricity imports, and in this sector, the Hungarian government can create difficulties for Ukraine. Ukrainians would do well to keep this in mind when, at various planning tables, they are deciding whether or not to bomb the Druzhba oil pipeline. So let that be on their minds.
At the same time, the Hungarian authorities criticize the European Union and NATO, even though they themselves are members of these organizations.
The Russian-Ukrainian war is a European issue, and you Europeans are incapable of resolving it. When two strong men, the American and Russian presidents, sit down at the negotiating table, and you just grumble from afar afterwards, you are pathetic and weak.
Has this kind of dependent attitude, to be honest, become tiresome for other countries in the European Union? Of course it has. Because essentially Orban is taking money for his blackmail. And we all understand perfectly well that the common pot of the European Union is filled by all the countries of the European Union. And simply paying Hungary for its loyalty is perceived quite critically by other EU leaders.
And the Hungarian Prime Minister Orban actively uses anti-Ukrainian rhetoric in his election propaganda. The media reported that even US President Trump called Orban and asked him to change his mind.
We don't want Ukrainians to drag us into their war. We don't want Hungarians to go die for Ukraine. We don't want our farmers to go bankrupt. We don't want Europe to turn into their mafia nest. We don't want Hungarian money to go to Ukraine.
I think he will drag out this process, sending signals, in fact, to Trump as well, so that he doesn't get angry, doesn't take offense, and continues to communicate with Orban and place his European political bet on him. But at the same time, not to rush too much, so as to squeeze as much blackmail money as possible out of the Europeans for such decisions.
Orban also claims that Hungary might even leave the European Union.
Hungary should leave the European Union in the near future, since the Union has turned from an economic one into a political one. I can promise Hungarian voters one thing: if I see that this EU membership is no longer worth it, I will speak out. But for now, I don't see any point in that.
If Hungary is not a member of the European Union, it will simply, well, most likely fall into a deep economic crisis. Does Orban understand this? Of course he does. And I would just see this as part of political rhetoric, nothing more, aimed against the current configuration within the European Union, portraying Orban as a great fighter.
But in reality, all that Hungary can really do is disrupt the work of organizations of which it is itself a member. But even this opportunity will soon be gone for it.
In Donbass, in the Vovchansk direction, a unique Russian flamethrower system, the Solntsepyok, has been destroyed. The Russians use it to break through defensive lines. Meanwhile, the General Staff reported the liberation of the village of Novoekonomichny near Pokrovsk in the Donetsk region. Assault groups of the Skelya regiment spent 2 weeks driving the occupiers out of every street, step by step. The Ukrainian flag is once again flying over the settlement.
Assault groups of the Skelya regiment have liberated the village of Novoekonomichny in Donetsk region. It took 2 weeks to gradually, step by step, clear every street. At night, enemy detection groups were deployed, followed by a coordinated assault and clearing operation. On August 31st, our flag was raised in the center of the settlement.
August 30th, 2025, and today we, the officers of the separate assault regiment Skelya, will raise this Ukrainian flag in the city of Novoekonomichny. Glory to Ukraine! Glory to the heroes!
Russia is preparing to strike at Ukraine's energy sector. Military radio technology specialist Serhiy Flesh Bezkresno writes that the enemy is actively conducting reconnaissance. The Russians are tracking substations, transformers, and the electrical and gas infrastructure. And the threat concerns not only the frontline zones. The occupiers are studying the protection of facilities, looking for weak points, likely to bring back blackouts and paralyze cities. Exercises involving the use of nuclear weapons have begun in Belarus. There, military exercises of CSTO member countries have begun, and planning for the use of nuclear weapons is part of them. More on the nuclear threat from Lukashenko next.
Lukashenko, following Putin, arrived in China to participate in the events of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit. And Russian troops have already been deployed on its territory. CSTO exercises and West 2025. What is happening on the border with Belarus while the two dictators have flown east?
They'll march on Kaliningrad, cut off the Baltics, seize 3 countries and so on, the usual NATO talk.
Military exercises involving nuclear weapons have begun in Belarus. Ukrainian border guards have heightened their readiness.
We feel confident and calm here. We are not hiding the subject of the exercises. We say that the main focus of the exercises is practicing the defense of our territory with a joint regional military group These activities are scheduled.
Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan have joined the Collective Security Treaty Organization exercises. China, North Korea, and India refuse to participate.
Their statements directed at Belarus, claiming that Belarus is threatening someone and that the Russian Federation is threatening, actually contradict the actions they themselves are taking.
According to preliminary estimates, there will be about 3,000 servicemen from Russia. Belarus will deploy between 7 and 10,000. The maneuvers, according to the authorities of the Republic of Belarus, will take place at the Losvito and Lepelsky training grounds.
Russia and Belarus are not just allies. We have a shared defense space, which we are strengthening due to the very complex international situation.
Belarus has planned several separate activities at once: exercises for the Collective Rapid Response Forces, Interaction 2025, training and deployment of reconnaissance assets, Search 2025, as well as maneuvers of logistics units, Echelon 2025.
The defense of our territory by the Joint Regional Group of Forces. These activities are planned, and this is not some sudden decision or anything like that.
According to the official version, their goal is to practice joint defensive and offensive actions.
Starting from 2020, a decision was made to create a regional group of forces. Yes, we strictly adhere to the decisions of our heads of state, and every 2 years we conduct these exercises.
It has been announced that the exercises will include the use of nuclear weapons and the Oreshnik missile system. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine has already responded to the exercises.
We warn Minsk against reckless provocations. We advise maintaining composure, not approaching the borders, and not provoking Ukraine's defense forces.
Belarus has stated that the nuclear weapons themselves will not be actively used in any conflict.
You can't use something that, let's say, poses a threat to the whole world, to global security. So how do you plan for that? We'll learn.
Analysts suggest that these exercises may have a hidden purpose: to create the conditions for amassing Russian troops and equipment on Belarusian territory.
We are ready for the exercises. We're not hiding anything from anyone. We are truly demonstrating openness, that these exercises are ours.
Such exercises traditionally cause concern among neighboring countries due to the risk of provocations, incidents, or unpredictable actions.
We have reduced the number of troops by almost half, moved their location deeper into our own territory, hundreds of kilometers away from the border to training grounds.
At the moment, Russian forces on Belarusian territory consist mainly of transport vehicles, a limited amount of armored equipment and personnel.
We are conducting these exercises independently, by our own decision, and not without regard to the countries to our west. This is about raising the level of training of our servicemen and the level of cooperation between the armed forces of Belarus and Russia. We are doing this for ourselves, to show, essentially, that we are ready to defend ourselves and do not threaten anyone.
However, the active phase of Zapad 2025 is scheduled for September 12 to 16. During this period, an increased presence of Russian units is expected, including tanks and armored vehicles.
They don't believe in this. And we don't believe it either, that it's possible to cross the Belarusian-Ukrainian border from here right now. We know what's happening at the border. It's completely reinforced with mines, it's mined, so if you try to go there, you'll lose thousands of people.
Well, of course.
Lukashenko has repeatedly assured that the upcoming exercises pose no threat either to Ukraine or to the Baltic countries or to Poland.
Well, they're warning us. Here's the Suwałki corridor, they'll go to Kaliningrad, cut off the Baltics, capture 3 countries and so on, the NATO ones.
However, back in 2022, he said the same thing about the impossibility of an invasion of Ukraine from Belarus after Zapad 2021, but a week later, he gave his territory to the Kremlin for the attack on Ukraine.
You accused Russia and Belarus that we would invade yesterday, that we would invade Ukraine. We didn't invade. So your intelligence and the billions of dollars you spend are worthless.
In response to the exercises in 2025, Poland will conduct its own strategic exercises called Iron Defender, which will also involve some NATO member countries.
The very fact of holding Russian-Belarusian exercises does not pose a threat to Poland. The Ministry of National Defense is taking them seriously. At present, there are no signs that these exercises could escalate into the threat of an armed conflict.
The commander of the Lithuanian army stated that about 40,000 military personnel will be concentrated in the Baltic countries and Poland.
These exercises, after the events of 2022 in Ukraine, have acquired clearly defined boundaries of perception. They are starting to be perceived not just as exercises, but as something perhaps more than mere military maneuvers. There will be disinformation coming from absolutely all sides. 90% will be Russian, and unfortunately, 10% will be from others. Hysteria will be fueled.
The situation on the border with Belarus and the monitoring of Russian military actions remain in the focus of attention for Ukrainian forces.
Veterans who underwent rehabilitation at Superhumans took their children to school. The supers, that's what the center's patients are called, shared that it was important for them to get their prosthetics before the first day of school. One of the fathers, serviceman Vyacheslav Kutin, who lost his legs after covering 4 grenades with them to save his comrades and returned from captivity this year, says, "On the first day of school, I was just as nervous as my..." That's all I have time to share for now. Please like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the most interesting news. See you next time.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism, and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.